Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for session 2. My name is Chris Rast. I'm part of the Convention Planning Committee for Inspire Ed this year. And it's my pleasure to reintroduce for session 2 Andy Wolfe. In the first session, Andy discussed and challenged us to think about our purpose as educational leaders. And I'm excited to hear what he has to say for round 2, relationships and well-being. For those of you just joining us, Andy is the co-author of Flourishing Together, a Christian Vision for Students, Educators, and Schools. He comes to us this morning from England, and his responsibility is with the Church of England in the education in Great Britain. So welcome, Andy. It's good to see you, and I'm looking forward to round 2.
Great. Chris, thank you so much for such a warm welcome, and it's fantastic to be with you all. One of the things that is going to make this session even more exciting is diving into the chat while you're watching. If only we were all in the same space, we could be having real conversations with one another. But for now, the chat will have to do. So I can see many of you introducing yourselves in the chat. I'd love you to do that. So welcome, Veronica. Welcome, Dawn and your team. Welcome to Tom, the Development Director at Bulkley Valley Christian School. Julie, welcome to you. Please just introduce yourselves into the chat there, and you'll get a sense of who is with us in the session. And throughout our session today, there's going to be a handful of moments where I'm going to be relying on you to get involved in the chat and to make this session even more interactive. So welcome to you all. As Chris said, my name's Andy Wolfe. I'm the Executive Director of Education for the Church of England, which means I help to oversee all of our work nationally across England. And for those of you who weren't in the previous session, the Church of England operates around 20% of all schools in England. So about 20% of all children in England go to Church of England schools. It's about 1 million children, which is a remarkable scale in lots of ways. Those are state-funded schools. There's a unique partnership between church and state. And we help to oversee all of their work nationally in terms of their policies and leadership development and governance and structures and all of those kinds of things. My background is as a music teacher. That's my initial teaching subject. Then I was a high school vice principal for many years, and then moved into this national role. And as Chris said, we are talking in this session about flourishing together. And I'm sure you all were there for Lynn's opening keynote, understanding that sense of flourishing and those 5 domains of flourishing. In our first breakout session, we talked about purpose, that core sense of our why and how it makes a difference to our what in education. In this session, we're going to be unpacking 2 of the domains, relationships, which we heard a lot about this morning, and also well-being. What I want to start with is this quotation from the book. We flourish together, not alone. We flourish together, not alone. And it says this: where there are few flourishing adults, there will be few flourishing children. I wonder if, as you just read that as an initial statement around our relationships together, what you make of it. And I'd love you just to begin in the chat, just to post why you think relationships are important to flourishing. We're making a really bold point there in the book that without flourishing adults, there'll be few flourishing children. What do you make of that? Now, as you'll know from the last session, we just need somebody to get this going in the chat. So please be the first. I wish I could offer some kind of prize. Please be the first to comment on that in terms of what you think about the importance of relationships in flourishing. Who will be first in there? Let us see. Go, go, go. Jason, will it be you? Janice? Brad, will it be you? Natalie? You can see more and more people joining the session. We're talking about flourishing together and the importance of relationships. What are your initial thoughts about those 2 quotes there? We flourish together, not alone. I need you to be bold. Thank you, Janice. Well done. Oh, here we go. Now it's happening. Here we go. Without relationship, there is no trust. Children learn from what we do, not by what we we can we can do very little in isolation. We need that sense of community. One body, many members. And Erin, top marks for you. You are quoting C.S. Lewis from Lynn's talk this morning. None can give to one another what he does not possess. Lynn is in the room with me at the moment, and she is thrilled to see that coordination and through flow of learning between our sessions is there. It's almost like we've written a book together. Without relationship, there really is no opportunity for flourishing. We're designed to be in that community. Absolutely. But yet it doesn't always feel like that, does it? Often education can feel a very isolated profession. If you're a teacher, you can feel that you spend most of the day with children, obviously, as you should, but very little time with your colleagues. If you're a school leader, you can feel like you're treading quite an isolated existence. Sometimes that can be a great joy. Sometimes that can be full of doubt and questions. Actually, our flourishing together is so, so important, and our flourishing is contingent on one another's. As I outlined in the first session, and as Lynn mentioned, we have put together this book, which we're very excited about. It helps to unpack some of the fantastic research that Lynn shared with us in the first session around these domains of flourishing. The book is out next week in North America, so please do get hold of that. And we're excited that this conference has brought a whole bunch of those books to send to your schools. For those of you who didn't catch those kind of 5 domains, the idea of relationships, of purpose, well-being, teaching, resources, they act as this ecology of 5, interacting with one another, not in some hierarchy. We're teaching the sessions in an order, but they're not in a hierarchical order. They are interacting between purpose and teaching, between relationships and well-being, between resources and relationships. You see what I mean? They're all acting together. And there's a second ecology in the book that we're going to be unpacking in our final keynote later this afternoon, which is all about the relationship here between flourishing adults and flourishing children in flourishing schools. And you can see from those arrows there on the picture that we are seeing those as a real ecology. I flourish because you flourish. You flourish because I flourish. And let's just be clear, flourishing does not mean everything is going okay. Please do not mishear us today that flourishing is all about the positives. It really isn't. If you think about any kind of plant or tree or any kind of organism that flourishes, there are seasons where the flowers are out, where the sun is shining, where it's impeccably beautiful, and you couldn't imagine anything better. There are also seasons where it is dark, it is rainy, it is cold, there's no growth, there's no flowers. Do you see what I mean? Flourishing is not simply saying, everything's getting better, I'm flourishing, and somehow you can walk around your school and spot who's flourishing because they're kind of skipping along, looking particularly happy on that day. So this idea of flourishing together is about the good times and the bad times, but something that is consistently growing through all of those seasons. So first, let's begin with this idea of relationship. Oh, in fact, before we dive into that, let's just highlight something that Edgar's put in the chat. Always keen to see something about golf in the chat. I mean, this is a wonderful turn. It is so much more rewarding to golf with others than by yourself. To be able to celebrate and commiserate one another allows us to grow and to flourish. Oh my goodness, we should have a game of golf sometime. We should go. I would love to celebrate with you as you play beautifully, and I'd love you to commiserate with me as I make yet another mistake. Golf is a great example of how it is better together, and it looks like Ronald is up for a game too, so maybe we could get that sorted. When we talk about the relationships domain, this is how we define that in the book. Our flourishing is dependent on who we are with. Our flourishing is dependent on who we are with. I don't know if you are sitting next to people who are in your school or not. If you are sitting next to them, have a look at them. Your flourishing is dependent on them. I don't know how you feel about that. Perhaps you're slightly nervous about that. Perhaps you're slightly relieved about that. Perhaps you're overjoyed about that. But when you look around the table, your flourishing is dependent on those who you are with. We're relational beings. The degree to which we value, honor, and care for each other, students, teachers, leaders, and families alike, impacts our mutual flourishing. School communities that are characterized by a sense of belonging are places where we can flourish together. Now, interesting word in there is belonging. Belonging. A sense that I matter, that I am valued, that I'm in the space and it is for me. If you have a sense of belonging, you take it for granted most often. You don't generally think, oh, wow, I'm back in a place I belong. But if you do not have that sense of belonging, it is a deep barrier to your flourishing if you don't feel you belong. And that is why our vision for flourishing is invitational. It's generous. It's generative. It says, who is not at our table and how can we invite them in to join us? That sense of belonging is absolutely critical to our flourishing. And if we're honest, faith-based groups, Christianity is not alone in this, do not necessarily have a strong track record for being inclusive of all, for welcoming all. And it is a real challenge and a real opportunity to think, if we genuinely think we flourish together, not alone, then who do we need to have at our table? Which voices are there, which are absent, and how might we invite them in? And that might be a challenge for you. And Faith, as you say, belonging is so key to your sense of flourishing and that sense of being connected. In some of our thinking in the UK, we talk a lot about the idea of diversity and inclusion. And in one of the documents that we have written, there's a section that I just want to refer to briefly. It's called Celebrating Diversity. It comes from the Church of England's document called Connected, Committed. And if you're in the first of my sessions, you'll have heard me refer to it. If you're interested in finding out about that, just Google now called Connected, Committed, and you'll be able to pull up the whole document and read it. But inside it, it talks about the importance of celebrating diversity. And this is what we say. Leaders in education cherish diversity and inclusion, recognizing that their communities are inherently better and richer in their differences. Inherently better and richer in their differences. They take every opportunity to celebrate learning together. And they hold their doors open to people from all backgrounds and traditions. They hold their doors open. Our flourishing together is so dependent on our ability to hold the door open. To hold the door open. I don't mean politely as people are walking down the corridor as they come through a door. I mean to hold the door open to the whole community. An authentic Christian vision for living well together is scandalously inclusive. I don't know what you make of that term, scandalously inclusive. You might balk at it slightly. You might think, goodness, that's a bit radical. But when you think about the way that Jesus seems to have spent his time, he seems to have been most interested at meeting with the people that others would not meet with. Breaking stereotypes of gender, of ethnicity, of age, of class. And showing that the kingdom of God is about the marginalized, the vulnerable, and the different, not about the conformity and staying in the box, staying in the lane. And I really thank you, Adam, for your comment there. That is really important for us to understand. Our schools need to be a place that celebrate diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. Diverse teams do not simply tick boxes or fulfill targets. We think, lead, teach, and learn better because of our diversity. I long to flourish together in a diverse workplace, with a diverse group of students, a diverse group of adults. And it's incumbent on us as leaders to think who is at our table and who is not. The theological backing for this comes, as you can see here outlined on the slide, that sense of true belonging. You know, a child needs to feel that they truly belong if they're to learn. An adult needs to feel that they truly belong if they are to flourish in your school. If there's any doubt in that, there will be a barrier to their flourishing. Institutional barriers can be an issue here. Children need to feel totally safe and secure, that their voice is heard and their ideas are acted upon. And a diverse sense of flourishing together believes that a hope-filled future can and will be theirs because they see themselves represented in all aspects of school life, particularly in leadership. Thank you for your comments there, Natalie, Steve. Christ was the great uniter. It's a question we'd have to ask the church. Is the church known as being a great uniter? Is that its pedigree? Is that its history? Is that its story? Not always. And so that's our great opportunity in schools, particularly when we're working with young people, forming, shaping their thinking. Then that idea of flourishing together in our difference is crucial to what we understand flourishing to be about in our relationships together. Inclusion usually requires particular attention to ethos, pedagogy, curriculum, to counter stereotypes, judgment, unjust discrimination, unconscious bias that's sometimes there. And where do we see that demonstrated? Well, it will be in our budgets, it will be in our staffing structures, it will be in our policies that determine who may come to our schools, who are they for, where are they built, why are they built. That sense of flourishing together is so important, and how our schools deal with difference is a crucial indicator of their quality. So I really want you to hear that sense of relationships being about difference as well as being about those with whom we normally associate. And that's a real challenge for us. I don't mean to make that sound straightforward. It's not. We operate in a context which is complicated in that sense. But it's incumbent on us to think, if we truly are following the life of Christ, what kind of people did he seem to open his doors to and hang out with? And therefore, what might be the implications for our school? To build that sense of trust and relationships requires something that we might think of as courage. Our relationships are built on courage, and I just want to give you a little sense of some etymology of the word courage that might just help you to think about what that might mean. You probably will know the French word le cœur, meaning heart. Literally, the word courage comes from the same root. That's where the word comes from. And literally what we therefore might mean by encouraging each other in our relationships is literally to put heart into. That's literally what it means to encourage. I encourage you by putting heart into you, by noticing things that you are doing well, by believing in them, by praising them. I'm giving you courage. You can also think about the word inspire. Inspire has the same kind of way it's constructed, that sense of in, like on in the start of the etymology. But that spire coming from the same root as we have like respiration, expiration, all about breath. So if I inspire you in our relationship, I'm literally putting breath into you. Our relationships, our flourishing, need to be in places of encouragement and inspiration, putting heart and breath into one another. Our courage and our relationships are about our shared story. Although we long for relationships where we tell beautiful stories of things going well, we also know that some of our greatest relationships are formed in challenging times. We talk about a community rooted in energizing memories and stories and histories that give us energy for the future and summoned by radical hopes. And this idea of these relationships being built around a shared narrative is important. Quite often we find that relationships are formed as people repeat stories, as they rehearse. Oh, do you remember when we ... Do you recall that time when we saw ... When, do you remember that moment when we experienced this together? That sense of shared narrative is really important to our flourishing. If I truly believe that I flourish because you flourish, that we flourish together, that we have that sense of story, that rhythm of prayer, and that sense of visionary leadership. The third part of courage is a word we often use in leadership, which is the word passion. The idea of passion in our education system and in our culture often is sort of meaning like energy and making things happen. And wow, she seems so passionate about that. It seems a very positive word. But again, if you understand the Latin root of the word passion, passion actually means suffering. The idea of, you'll know the musical pieces by Bach, like the St. John's Passion or the St. Matthew Passion. The Passion of the Christ is the story of the suffering of Jesus. And the idea of having passion or compassion is to be able to suffer together. That's what some of our relationships do. Sometimes our flourishing is so dependent on somebody who is happy to come alongside us in our most challenging times and say, do you know what? I am with you. I cannot change what you're experiencing. I cannot take it away. But I am with you. It's what great friends do. It's what great families do. It's what great schools do for their children and for their adults in terms of their flourishing together. This quote, the capacity and readiness to care, to suffer, to die, and to feel this idea of our relationships being ready to suffer for one another. Now, no one would probably say, I just can't wait for things to go wrong. Bring on the suffering. That's not what we would say in our schools at all, is it? But actually, when we read that Romans 5 promise of where does hope come from, Paul says, how can I explain hope? How can I really sum it up to my readers? And he says this, we also glory in our sufferings because we know that our suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. That journey from suffering to hope. And that idea of Kierkegaard, who said that hope is a passion for the possible, the idea that we see something that does not yet exist, but we have that sense of having a passion for it. Lastly, around this, we can think about the idea of imagination, that ability to see a future that does not yet exist. And there's an amazing book called The Prophetic Imagination. It's by Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament theologian. And when somebody recommended I should read it, I actually was quite bemused because it doesn't seem to have anything to do with education whatsoever. It's actually a study of the Old Testament prophets, of Moses and Jeremiah and Isaiah and a number of others. And in the book, Brueggemann says this, the imagination must come before the implementation. The imagination must come before the implementation. And our relationships and our sense of flourishing together is all about the ability to keep alive what he calls the ministry of imagination. So when we think about these 4 dimensions to courage and how they're right at the heart of those relationships that we seek for our flourishing together, I wonder what you make of that. I wonder what you make of that ecology there that I'm setting up, of heart, that idea to put heart into others, to inspire others, to have a shared story, to be willing to suffer for one another, and to imagine a future that does not exist. Those are the kind of relationships I want to be a part of. Those are the kind of relationships that I want my children to be a part of, my staff, my teams, the ability to have heart, story, passion, imagination. In the bit that we've written, there's a range of reflections that kind of get us thinking a little bit about what this might mean in practice. And we're going to move to a short time of reflection and discussion. I don't know whether you're sitting with people that you can have an actual conversation with, or whether you're on your own watching this while other colleagues in your school are watching. It's difficult for me to know, of course. But what I'd like you to do in this sort of 5 or 6 minutes that we've got now is to think about some of these questions that I've put on the screen here. Who gives you courage in your role? In what you're doing, who are the people that are around you who give you courage, who put heart into you, who enable you to take the next step, even if you're not quite sure where that next step is headed? How long can you survive in an organization without encouragement from others? What might it mean to suffer together? And how do we build a culture in which those that fall are instinctively held up? I'd love you to just give some thought to that as we take just a pause now to discuss that in our groups. And what I'd love you to do is in the chat, if you're so bold and brave, I'd love you to write a response to that first question. It might be a personal response. You don't need to give people's names. Just give us a sense of who those people are who give you courage in your role. When you think about people who put heart into you, who are those people? So we're going to take about 6 minutes on this, and then I'd love you during that 6 minutes to just have a time to reflect on that central notion of relationships and who gives you courage. We'll be back in 6 minutes. Well, welcome back, everybody. And can I just thank you for sharing so openly and vulnerably in the chat. All the people who are physically in the room with me, which is not many, I have to say, but they're all engrossed in what people are saying in the chat because people are being able to share so vulnerably. If only we could be together to actually verbalize it. But let's just highlight a few of those things. People are talking about particular kind of roles of people that students, colleagues, the SCS BC team get a mention in here in terms of giving courage. So yes, go team. That's really encouraging to see. God, the Lord, a lot of people mentioning students. Sometimes my most troublesome September students are the ones I miss most come June. That's such a profound point, isn't it? Children who you think, oh my, wow, okay, what's this year going to be like? And it turns out to be the shaping of them. Amazing. The shaping of you as well. The resilience of some students. Christy, thank you for sharing this. The resilience of some students gives us courage to continue advocating for them and supporting them as they grow. Tom, this is beautiful how you've put this. We're talking about flourishing together. Tom says suffering together redeems suffering into an opportunity for shared growth. Wow. If only the book wasn't published, we should put that straight in. Suffering together redeems the suffering into an opportunity for shared growth. It deepens connection to see a vulnerability in our colleagues. Creating a space that Adam shares for people to safely share when they are struggling without shame. Modeling sets the culture. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And that idea of our relationships being foundational to our flourishing is absolutely important. And we've got to hang on to that because this is a profession that feels like we're alone on so many occasions. We've got to be bold and we've got to be deliberate to say, no. Flourishing is a social construct, not an individual sense of performance. Our flourishing, secondly, in this session is really tied up with our well-being. And I don't know how you're feeling as you come to this session today on this Friday in terms of your own well-being. But we talk in the book about how important that is for the flourishing of students and educators, and therefore the flourishing of schools. Well-being we define as the physical and emotional health characterized by healthy habits and developing resilience is critical to whether and how students flourish. The same holds true for teachers and leaders. Those in helping professions like teaching can only help others out of a place of abundance. You can only help other people out of a place of abundance. And sometimes you are asked to help others out of a place of not abundance, where the fuel gauge is empty, where your resources are running dry, where you are seeking something that isn't actually there. We need to keep those reservoirs of hope really topped up. And for this reason, flourishing schools prioritize the well-being of the community. And wasn't it fantastic that Lynn mentioned this morning this idea of wellness, and that wellness policy for schools that they could have in terms of looking after one another, ensuring that sense of well-being. In her inspirational book, Daring Greatly, Brené Brown talks about this at length. There's some fantastic things in this book for you as a professional. There's some fantastic things in this book for you as an individual, and in terms of your own understanding of vulnerability in leadership. But she talks about letting go of certain things. And it's interesting, actually, Jason, that you've put in the chat, we have to take competition out of the equation. This is so important for our relationships and our well-being. But she talks about, as you can see there on the slide, letting go of comparison to cultivate creativity. Establishing conditions where adults and students can think, gosh, I don't need to compare myself to everybody else. I need to become genuinely creative. I wish someone had told me that when I was a child. Letting go of what people think and cultivating authenticity. That's so important for our well-being, isn't it? Letting go of perfectionism, that everything needs to be just so, and cultivating self-compassion. It's okay to be kind to yourself. In fact, it's more than okay. It's integral to your flourishing to be kind to yourself. Letting go of the need for certainty. Letting go of anxiety as a lifestyle. I don't know whether that resonates with you. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't resonate with you, I'm sure it will resonate with somebody on your staff. Somebody, whether you know it or not on your staff, is probably going through something really complex at the moment. And how could you let go of that sense of anxiety and cultivate calm and stillness? A reframing of the storm in which you find yourself in. It doesn't take away the challenge. Vulnerability doesn't say, hey, just because I shared it, it all went away. It doesn't say that. But our well-being and our flourishing is so linked to our ability to dwell in the challenge together, not alone. How many times have you sat alone worrying about something where what you really need to do is share. Pick up the phone, write the email, send the text, get in the car. You do not have to do this alone. In his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr makes a really interesting point around this, which is a challenging point. Says this: the human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to failing. It's not that suffering or failure might happen, or that it will only happen to you if you are bad, which is what some religious people think, or that it will happen to the unfortunate, or to a few in other places, or that you can somehow, by cleverness or righteousness, avoid it. No, it will happen, and to you. It's not a very motivational quote to put on your wall, is it? The certainty of suffering. But he goes on to say this: losing, falling, failing, sin, and the suffering that comes from those experiences. All of this is a necessary and even good part of the human journey. Our well-being is not simply contingent on our circumstance or how happy we are. Flourishing together is not like how many people in our schools are happy today. It's 78%. Fantastic. We're really flourishing now. It's not that. It takes a foundational trust to fall or to fail and not to fall apart. Let me just repeat that again, and I'm saying this as much to myself as to anyone who happens to be on this webinar today. It takes a foundational trust to fall or to fail and not fall apart. Faith alone holds you while you stand waiting and hoping and trusting. In the New Testament, there are a whole bunch of letters written by the Apostle Paul, and one of the most inspirational in this sense is 2 Corinthians. I don't know whether you've read it ever or recently, or whether you've really had a chance to dive into it. But one of the incredible things about this letter is that Paul, who we know as this kind of incredible superhero leader, the pioneer of the early church, who, for which, incredible reputation, one of the most effective leaders of all time, you could say. If only he'd had a book out at the time, I'm sure he would have sold millions. But in 2 Corinthians, we find Paul in a mess. We find Paul and his well-being littered with questions, oozing doubt, and wondering whether he knows the next step forward. It's a letter that shows a leader at their most vulnerable, and it's unusual because our models of leadership don't tend to prioritize that. We read books, don't we, about how to be more effective and how to have a greater impact, and some of those books are quite frustrating, actually, because you just wonder whether these people have ever had any problems whatsoever. But the point that Paul's making here is that we do need vulnerability to understand our well-being, and we do need vulnerability to understand our relationship with God. The Christian life is not simply about everything going well. That's not what it's about necessarily. But this is incredibly important. And what he talks about in 2 Corinthians, just a few quotes that I've pulled out here from the letter. And if you've not read it before, I really commend to you just to sit and read the letter. It'll probably take you about 45 minutes to read the whole thing through. Imagine it was a letter that you received. In it, Paul says, we were under pressure far beyond our ability to endure. I wonder if you felt like that in your role, under pressure far beyond your ability to endure. We had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside and fears within. Have you ever experienced that? Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry of teaching, leading in education, we do not lose heart. Doesn't mean as soon as we pray, everything disappears and our well-being shoots up again and we're flourishing and everyone can see that. It doesn't mean that. It means that we're able to reshape the challenges that we experience. And then Paul, most famously in this letter, talks about this metaphor of jars of clay. Corinth, as you may know, is a Greek city known for, at the time, it's a great trading port and known for its exquisite pottery. It's not necessarily something we would know about now, but it's historically known for that particular industry. And so the fact that Paul uses this metaphor to communicate with the believers in Corinth is fascinating. He's saying that the treasure that we have, our faith in God, is not in some fancy pot, some high-end, expensive thing that would be so fragile and could be damaged. It's in the ordinary. It's in the jar of clay, the normal pot that's on anybody's kitchen side. And this treasure shows that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. He says we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Now, this is not like just a motivational quote, but it's actually a really important part of how we understand well-being in a Christian context. And it reveals itself when we understand the Greek a little bit more. So I'm just going to unpack this verse a little bit more for you to help you kind of get a bit more insight in.